Eliza Winters saw him the moment she stepped into the crowded cafe. How could she not? After 3 years, Nathan's profile was still instantly recognizable, the slight hunch of his shoulders as he typed, the way he absently pushed his glasses up with his knuckle, the coffee he never finished. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she ducked behind a tall businessman scrolling through his phone. For 8 months, she'd managed to avoid Nathan in a city of millions. Today, her luck had run out. If you're enjoying this story so far, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories that explore the complexities of human relationships. Your support means everything. She could leave. That would be the sensible thing to do. Just turn around and walk out before he spotted her. But something rooted her to the spot, perhaps the same something that had kept her awake on countless nights, wondering if she'd made the right choice. So instead, Eliza straightened her spine, fixed her gaze directly over his head as if looking at someone beyond him, and walked purposefully toward the counter. 3 years ago, Nathan Fuller had been her best friend. 2 years ago, he had broken something so precious between them that she'd believed it could never be repaired. And now, as she ordered her latte with artificial calmness, she pretended not to see him, just as she had pretended not to see his calls, his messages, and eventually, his absence. Nathan looked up from his laptop just as she turned away from the counter. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second before Eliza deliberately shifted her gaze. A small, involuntary intake of breath was the only indication that she'd seen him at all. Eliza? His voice carried over the ambient chatter of the cafe. She could still leave. The barista hadn't even started making her drink. But running had never been Eliza's way, even when it should have been. So she stood frozen, her back to him, contemplating her next move when his voice came again, closer this time. Eliza, please. The raw emotion in those 2 words, not demanding, but pleading, made her turn despite herself. There he stood, just a few feet away, looking simultaneously exactly the same and completely different. The same unruly dark hair and thoughtful eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, but thinner now, with new lines etched around his mouth. "Hello, Nathan," she said, her voice impressively steady despite the earthquake happening inside her chest. He blinked rapidly, as if surprised she'd acknowledged him at all. I've been hoping I might run into you. Have you?" The coolness in her tone wasn't entirely deliberate. Self-preservation had built walls around her heart long ago. "I've been coming here every Tuesday and Thursday morning for the past 4 months, he admitted. I remembered it was your favorite." Something twisted painfully in her chest. She glanced at her watch, a deliberate gesture to signal disinterest. "I'm actually in a hurry, so." "I fixed it," he blurted out. Eliza froze. "Fixed what?" "Everything." Nathan's eyes held hers, unflinching now. "Well, myself first. And then, everything else I could." He reached into his messenger bag and withdrew something small, wrapped in tissue paper. "Including this." With hesitant fingers, Eliza accepted the package. Unwrapping it carefully, she felt the air leave her lungs in a rush when she saw what lay inside, her grandmother's antique music box. The very one she'd hurled at him that final, terrible night. The one that had shattered against the wall behind him, its delicate mechanism destroyed along with their friendship. "How did you?" she whispered, her fingers tracing the intricate inlaid pattern on the lid, restored so perfectly it was impossible to tell it had ever been broken. "It took me a year to find all the pieces," Nathan said quietly. "And another to learn how to fix it properly." Eliza looked up at him, really seeing him for the first time. "Why?" "Because I broke what mattered most to you." His voice dropped to barely a whisper. "And I've spent every day since trying to become someone worthy of fixing what I broke between us." The barista called out her name, but Eliza barely heard it. She was already tumbling back through time, to the beginning, to understand how they had arrived at this moment. Eliza had first met Nathan Fuller during her sophomore year of college. She had been rushing to her contemporary literature class, late as usual, when she'd collided with him outside the humanities building. Her books and papers had scattered across the rain-dampened walkway, and she'd been on the verge of tears, until he'd knelt beside her, helping to gather her things, making jokes about how he'd always wanted to literally run into a pretty girl but had hoped it would be less painful for both parties. They'd become instant friends, the kind of rare, effortless friendship that seems written by fate. Nathan, with his quiet intelligence and dry humor, complemented Eliza's more impulsive, vibrant personality. They studied together, argued passionately about books and politics, and shared their dreams over countless cups of coffee. He wanted to become an architectural engineer, she was pursuing journalism with a focus on international affairs. By senior year, they were inseparable. When Eliza's grandmother passed away, leaving her the antique music box that had soundtracked her childhood visits, it was Nathan who held her as she cried. When he received a prestigious job offer across the country, it was Eliza who convinced him to take it, promising their friendship would survive the distance. And it had, for a while. Weekly video calls and constant texts maintained their connection. Eliza visited him in Seattle twice, and he returned to Chicago whenever he could. Then came the opportunity, a fellowship program in architectural restoration in Italy. 1 year abroad, working with master craftsmen to restore historical buildings in Florence. "You have to go," Eliza had insisted during their video call, ignoring the sinking feeling in her stomach. "This is literally what you've dreamed about since freshman year." "I know, but..." Nathan had hesitated, his eyes searching hers through the screen. "I don't want to be that much further away from you." Something in his tone had shifted then, something that had been building between them for years, unacknowledged by either of them. A current that ran deeper than friendship, terrifying in its intensity. "We'll be fine," she'd assured him, smiling brightly to cover her uncertainty. "What's another few thousand miles between friends, right?" He'd gone to Italy. Their communication had become more sporadic, time differences, busy schedules, new experiences pulling them in different directions. Eliza had thrown herself into her work at the newspaper, taking on additional assignments to fill the strange emptiness that Nathan's absence had created. And then came the email from her editor, an opportunity for Eliza to cover a series of architectural restoration projects across Europe, including Florence. She hadn't told Nathan she was coming. Some childish part of her had wanted to surprise him, to see his face when she appeared unexpectedly. Perhaps, secretly, she'd wanted to see if he would be as happy to see her as she was desperate to see him. The surprise had been hers in the end. She'd found his apartment easily enough from the address he'd given her months before. It was late afternoon, golden Italian sunlight slanting across the narrow streets. She'd climbed the 4 flights of stairs, heart pounding with anticipation, and knocked on his door. A young woman had opened it, beautiful, with olive skin and dark curls tumbling over her shoulders. "Posso aiutarti?" she'd asked, clearly confused by Eliza's presence. Before Eliza could respond, Nathan had appeared behind the woman, his expression shifting from casual happiness to shock when he saw who stood in his doorway. "Eliza? What, how are you here?" The woman, Sophia, as Eliza would later learn, had turned to Nathan with a questioning look. He'd said something to her in Italian, his arm sliding naturally around her waist in a gesture that told Eliza everything she needed to know. "I'm sorry," Eliza had managed to say, her voice strange in her own ears. "I should have called first. I'm in town for work, and I thought..." What had she thought? That he'd been sitting around pining for her? That the unspoken thing between them had been as real for him as it had been for her? Nathan had insisted she come in. Had introduced Sophia as a fellow architect in the program. Had explained awkwardly that they'd been dating for almost 4 months. All while Eliza had smiled and nodded and pretended that her world wasn't collapsing around her. Later, after an excruciating coffee where Sophia had been perfectly lovely and Nathan unnaturally animated, Eliza had made her excuses and fled. Nathan had followed her outside. "Why didn't you tell me?" she'd asked, hating the tremor in her voice. "I tried," he'd said. "Remember that call a few months ago when you were on deadline? I started to tell you about Sophia, but you were so busy, and then you had to go suddenly." She remembered. She'd been avoiding the conversation because something in his voice had told her he had news that would hurt her. And then it just got harder to bring it up, he'd continued. "I didn't want to tell you something this important over text, but our calls kept getting shorter and less frequent." He'd run a hand through his hair, a gesture so familiar it made her chest ache. "I'm sorry, Eliza. I should have made sure you knew." "It doesn't matter," she'd lied. "We're friends. I'm happy for you." But something had broken between them that day, the potential of what might have been shattered by reality and poor timing and things left unsaid for too long. She'd completed her assignment in Florence in record time and moved on to the next city on her itinerary, ignoring Nathan's messages asking to meet again before she left. For the next 6 months, their communication had been strained, increasingly infrequent. She'd buried herself in work, he'd continued his life in Italy, and the distance between them had grown into something that seemed unbridgeable. Until he'd returned to the States and shown up at her apartment unannounced, a mirror image of her surprise visit to him, except this time he'd come alone, his relationship with Sophia having ended months before. "I missed you," he'd said simply, standing in her doorway with shadows under his eyes. "Nothing felt right without being able to tell you about it." She'd let him in because she'd missed him too, desperately. For one evening, it had almost felt like old times, until he'd mentioned, casually, that he was considering taking a permanent position back in Florence. "They've offered me a role with their heritage conservation team," he'd explained excitedly. "Working on buildings that have stood for centuries, Eliza. The craftsmanship, the history, it's everything I've ever wanted professionally." "So you're going back," she'd said flatly. "I wanted to talk to you about it first." "About us." "There is no us," she'd responded, the words like glass in her throat. "There's you in Florence with your perfect job and your Italian girlfriends, and there's me here, with my life that doesn't include you anymore." His face had fallen. "That's not fair. You're the one who pushed me to go in the first place. Because that's what friends do. They support each other's dreams, even when it hurts." "And what about my other dreams?" he'd asked, his voice dropping. "The ones that always included you?" "You don't get to say that to me now," she'd whispered furiously. "Not after everything. Not after Sophia." "Sophia was never," he'd stopped, frustrated. "I waited for you, Eliza. For years. I thought I was being respectful, not risking our friendship until I was sure you felt the same way. And then when I finally worked up the courage to tell you how I felt, you were dating Ryan. That was 5 years ago. And it lasted all of 2 months. And after that, there was always someone else, or some reason why the timing wasn't right. Then I moved away, and you encouraged me to go even though. Even though what? Even though I was half hoping you'd ask me to stay." The argument had escalated from there, years of miscommunication and unacknowledged feelings erupting like a volcano. Accusations had flown, he'd accused her of deliberately keeping him at arm's length, she'd accused him of giving up on them too easily. Old wounds had been reopened, new ones inflicted. And then he'd said the unforgivable thing. "Maybe the truth is you were never brave enough to admit what you really wanted. You'd rather keep people at a safe distance than risk actually letting someone in completely." It had struck too close to home, piercing the armor she'd built around her heart. In a moment of blind fury and pain, Eliza had grabbed the nearest object, her grandmother's music box, and hurled it in his direction. She hadn't meant to hit him, just to express the intensity of her feelings, but the damage had been done. The precious heirloom had shattered against the wall, its melody silenced forever. The horror on Nathan's face had matched her own. He'd immediately dropped to his knees, trying to gather the broken pieces, apologizing desperately. But Eliza, overwhelmed by loss, of the music box, of what could have been with Nathan, of her own self-control, had ordered him to leave. "Just go back to Florence," she'd said, tears streaming down her face. "That's what you really want anyway. Eliza, please. We're done, Nathan. Some things can't be fixed." He'd left the broken pieces of the music box on her coffee table, along with his heart. She'd refused his calls and messages in the days that followed. When a package had arrived containing the fragments of the music box he'd managed to collect, accompanied by a note promising to make it right somehow, she'd put it all in a box and shoved it into the back of her closet, trying to do the same with her feelings. For 2 years, she'd pretended he didn't exist. Had pretended not to notice when mutual friends mentioned his name. Had pretended not to care when she heard he'd turned down the position in Florence and moved back to Chicago instead. Had pretended not to see him that time in the grocery store 6 months ago, when she'd abandoned a full cart of groceries to avoid an encounter. And now here he was, standing before her in their old favorite cafe, holding the physical manifestation of what had broken between them, somehow restored to wholeness. "Open it," Nathan urged gently, pulling Eliza back to the present. With trembling fingers, she lifted the lid of the music box. The familiar melody, Debussy's Clair de Lune, her grandmother's favorite, filled the small space between them, as clear and perfect as it had been in her childhood. "How?" she asked again, unable to comprehend the painstaking work this restoration must have required. "I found a master craftsman in Vienna who specializes in antique music boxes," Nathan explained. "But he would only take it on if I apprenticed with him to help with the restoration. Said something this personal shouldn't be fixed by a stranger's hands alone." Eliza stared at him, stunned. "You apprenticed with a craftsman? For how long?" 6 months, he said with a small shrug, as if it were nothing. 3 days a week, after my regular job. Turns out architectural restoration skills are somewhat transferable, though this was considerably more delicate work. "You spent 6 months learning how to fix my grandmother's music box?" The enormity of this gesture was almost impossible to grasp. "I spent 6 months learning how to fix what I'd broken," he corrected gently. "Both the music box and everything else. Myself included." He hesitated, then added, "I've been in therapy for the past 1.5 years. Working on the parts of me that needed fixing too." Eliza closed the music box carefully, holding it against her chest. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything right now," Nathan assured her. "I didn't do this expecting forgiveness or anything else. I did it because it needed to be done, regardless of the outcome." He smiled, a small, sad thing. "Your latte's getting cold." She glanced over at the counter where her forgotten drink sat. "Would you?" The words stuck in her throat. She swallowed hard and tried again. "Would you like to sit with me? Just for a few minutes?" Relief washed over his features. "I'd like that very much." They sat at a small table by the window, the music box between them like a bridge spanning a chasm. For the first few minutes, they engaged in careful small talk, his job at a local firm specializing in historical restoration, her recent promotion to features editor. The weather. Mutual friends. Safe topics that didn't touch the deeper currents running beneath the surface. Then Eliza took a breath and dove in. "Why didn't you go back to Florence? I know they offered you the position." Nathan studied his coffee cup. "Some dreams lost their appeal when I realized what pursuing them would cost me." He looked up at her. "I didn't understand at first. I thought I could have both, the career I'd always wanted and you in my life. It took me losing both to realize which one mattered more. But your work there, you loved it. The buildings, the history." "I did. I do." He nodded. "But I found a different way to pursue that passion. The firm I'm with now is doing some incredible work right here. Different challenges, but equally meaningful." He smiled slightly. And it turns out there's quite a demand for historical restoration in a city as old as Chicago. Eliza felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the tight knot she'd carried for 2 years. I shouldn't have thrown the music box, she admitted quietly. I'm not proud of that moment. I shouldn't have said what I did, he countered. It was cruel and unfair, especially coming from someone who claimed to care about you. Was it untrue, though? She asked, surprising herself with her candor. About me keeping people at a distance? Nathan considered this. I think we were both guilty of that. Me just as much as you. I spent years not telling you how I felt because I was afraid of risking our friendship. Then I resented you for not somehow knowing anyway. He shook his head ruefully. My therapist had a field day with that one. A small laugh escaped her, the sound strange and welcome in the context of this conversation. My therapist too, actually. His eyebrows rose. You've been in therapy? For about a year now, she confirmed. Turns out hurling priceless family heirlooms is something of a wake-up call regarding one's emotional regulation skills. They shared a smile, tentative but real. The first authentic connection they'd had in years. I missed this, Nathan said softly. Just, talking to you. No one else ever really got my jokes. That's because your jokes are terrible, Eliza replied automatically, falling into their old rhythm for a moment before catching herself. There she is, he murmured, his eyes warm with affection. Eliza felt tears threatening and blinked them back. I should go. I have a meeting at 11. Of course. Nathan nodded, trying to hide his disappointment. He watched as she gathered her things, carefully placing the music box in her bag. As she stood to leave, Eliza hesitated. Nathan? Yes? Thank you. For fixing it. For everything. He smiled, a real smile this time, reaching his eyes. You're welcome, Eliza. She turned to go, made it 3 steps toward the door, then stopped and turned back. Would you like to get coffee sometime? Or dinner, maybe? The hope that bloomed on his face was almost too much to bear. I'd like that very much. I'll call you, she promised, and for the first time in years, she meant it. As Eliza stepped out into the crisp autumn air, she felt lighter somehow, as if something long broken inside her had finally begun to heal. The music box nestled safely in her bag, its melody silent for now but ready to play again whenever she opened it, just like her heart. Over the following weeks, Eliza and Nathan cautiously rebuilt their connection. Coffee turned into dinner, dinner into long walks through the city they both loved. They talked about everything and nothing, carefully navigating the new terrain of their relationship while acknowledging the history that had brought them to this point. I still don't understand why you didn't tell me you were working on the music box all that time, Eliza said one evening as they strolled along the lakefront, the city lights reflecting on the water. 2 years is a long time to work on something in secret. I wasn't sure you'd even accept it when I was done, Nathan admitted. And I needed to do it regardless of the outcome. If I'd told you about it, there would have been pressure, expectations. This way, the only pressure was the kind I put on myself. And what if we'd never run into each other at the cafe? He smiled sheepishly. I told you, I'd been going there regularly hoping to see you. But I also had a backup plan. Your birthday is next month. I was going to mail it to you then, with a letter. What would the letter have said? She asked, genuinely curious. Nathan looked out over the water, considering. That I was sorry. That I hoped the music box brought back the good memories it was meant to preserve. That I'd learned to fix broken things, starting with myself. He glanced at her. And that I would always be grateful for the time we had together, even if we never spoke again. Eliza felt her throat tighten with emotion. That's a good letter, she managed to say. I have my moments, he replied with a self-deprecating smile. As they continued walking, their hands brushed against each other, once, twice, a third time, until Eliza finally gathered her courage and laced her fingers through his. Nathan looked down at their joined hands, then at her face, his expression a mixture of wonder and tentative joy. They took things slowly, both aware of how much was at stake. There were difficult conversations, about Florence and Sophia, about Eliza's fears of abandonment stemming from her parents' turbulent marriage, about Nathan's tendency to suppress his own needs to keep peace. They discussed the years of miscommunication, the assumptions they'd made about each other's feelings, the opportunities they'd missed through fear or pride or simple bad timing. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I'd just told you how I felt back in college?" Nathan asked one rainy afternoon as they sat in his apartment, sharing a pot of tea and watching old movies. "We probably would have messed it up," Eliza replied honestly. "I wasn't ready then." "Neither were you, really." "And now?" The question hung between them, weighty with possibility. Eliza considered it carefully. "Now. I think we've both done enough work on ourselves to actually have a chance." 6 months after their chance encounter at the cafe, Eliza found herself standing in Nathan's living room, watching as he hung a framed architectural drawing on the wall, a gift from her to celebrate his recent promotion. "Perfect," she declared as he stepped back to assess the placement. "Almost," he corrected, moving it a fraction of an inch to the left. Eliza rolled her eyes fondly. "Some things never change." "And some things do," Nathan countered, turning to face her. "For the better." He crossed the room to where she stood and took her hands in his expression suddenly serious. "I've been thinking about something a lot lately." "Should I be worried?" she teased, though her heart had begun to beat a little faster. "No, just listen for a minute." He took a deep breath. "When we were younger, I used to imagine what it would be like if we ever got together. I had this whole fantasy about how it would unfold, the perfect timing, the perfect words." Eliza squeezed his hands encouragingly. And then life happened. Messy, complicated, imperfect life. We hurt each other. We broke things that seemed irreparable. We lost years we can never get back. His eyes held hers, unflinching. "And yet, somehow, here we are." "Here we are," she echoed softly. "I don't want to waste any more time, Eliza. I know we've only been back in each other's lives for 6 months, but I've loved you for over a decade, through every mistake and misunderstanding, through distance and silence and everything in between." Eliza felt tears welling in her eyes. "Nathan. I'm not proposing," he clarified quickly. "Not yet. But I am asking you to think about moving in together. About building a life together, officially. About giving us the chance we never properly gave ourselves before." For a moment, Eliza was transported back to that terrible night 2 years ago, when everything had shattered between them. She remembered the feeling of complete hopelessness, the certainty that some breaks were permanent, some damage beyond repair. And then she thought about the music box, now sitting on her bedside table. About how it had been restored piece by painstaking piece, until it played its melody as sweetly as it ever had, perhaps even more precious now for having been broken and mended with such care. "Yes," she said simply, her voice clear and certain. "Yes to all of it." The joy that transformed Nathan's face was worth every painful moment of their journey. As he pulled her into his arms, Eliza reflected that perhaps some things needed to break completely before they could be rebuilt stronger than before, not in spite of their fractures, but because of them. 1 year later, on a summer evening in the small garden behind their shared apartment, Eliza and Nathan sat among friends and family, celebrating their engagement. The antique music box held a place of honor on a small table, playing its gentle melody as glasses were raised in toast. "To fixing what's broken," Nathan offered, his eyes never leaving Eliza's face. "And to seeing each other," she added, "even when it's easier to look away." As their guests echoed the sentiment, Eliza reflected on the long, winding path that had brought them to this moment. There had been so many points where their story might have ended differently, where pride or fear or simple bad timing might have kept them apart forever. Instead, they had learned perhaps the most important lesson of all, that some things worth having require work to maintain, courage to pursue, and heart to restore when damaged. That love isn't always easy or straightforward, but rather a continuous choice to see each other, truly see each other, through all the brokenness and beauty that life contains. And in that seeing, that recognition of both